Hello, welcome to GCSE Religious Studies Revision. We're looking at the topic of bioethics. We've got quite a bit to get through, so let's get started. Bioethics just refers to the rights and wrongs of medical treatment, and what we're going to look at here is the topic of fertility treatment, and we're also going to have a little look at embryo experimentation. Now, we're going to start with the Roman Catholic view of sex and reproduction, because that has implications for how we look at fertility treatment. And the traditional or the official Roman Catholic view is very much at odds with what secular society or non-religious society would think today. So it gives you plenty to debate about. The Roman Catholic view is that sex has been given by God as a gift, and it would be wrong or immoral or wicked to use God's gift in a way that he did not intend it. Now, simply by looking at nature, by looking at how human beings are designed, and by looking at how animals are designed, and look at the whole structure of nature and the world around us, Roman Catholics would argue that we can infer certain truths about how God wants us to behave. And if we look at sex and we look at what sex is about and what sex is for, Roman Catholics say, well, we can get some fairly straightforward moral truths here. So sex quite clearly has two functions. The first is its role in procreation. Sex is something which is given to create the next generation of human beings, and that's simple and that's straightforward. But it also has a unitive function. It brings a man and a woman together into one body. The one body in the sense of a man cannot reproduce on his own, a woman cannot reproduce on her own. The two need to come together into one unit to be able to reproduce. And that's not merely a physical union, that's a spiritual and a moral and a mental union. In other words, there's a deep friendship, a deep affection that goes along with sex that's quite normal and quite natural. And this is something which should be connected to marriage, should be connected to a very deep, loving relationship. So sex has these two functions. It's got the procreative function. It should at least be able to bring about a new life, and it also should bring two people together. Now, what Roman Catholics officially argue, the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church would be, is that it is always wrong to use sex or to reproduce in such a way that undermines or that goes against these purposes of sex. So sex should be fit for procreation, it should be suitable for procreation, and it should always bring two people together into one body, into one union, into one life. That then means that certain forms of fertility treatment are considered to be wrong in official Roman Catholic teaching. So we'll consider a few of those. In artificial insemination, semen is placed into the woman's uterus using artificial means rather than by natural sex. Now, you can have artificial insemination by husband or by partner, and in that case, a couple who are struggling with infertility use artificial insemination as a means to treat that infertility on the doctor's recommendation. And generally, Protestants have no difficulty with that so long as there's a loving relationship between the two, so long as the two are married. This is considered by most Protestants to be a perfectly acceptable way of dealing with infertility. Artificial insemination by donor is a more problematic area because at that stage you're introducing a third person into the marriage, arguably. And in the case of artificial insemination by donor, it's usually a completely anonymous donor. So the father is completely unknown to the biological mother in this instance. And that creates issues later on in life when the child might have to find out who their biological parent actually is and their biological father actually is. In case, for example, there are diseases passed on through the biological father's DNA. Roman Catholics would be against artificial insemination by husband or by donor because in that case you have reproduction without the unitive aspect of sex. So in other words, the man and the woman have not been made into one body, and that is wrong. That is going against the design which God has given us. It's treating God's gift with contempt, if you like. So the official Roman Catholic position would not allow for that. Evangelical Protestants, traditional Protestants, tend to be a little more generous in this area, and they would say, listen, that is trying to apply God's plan to each and every individual act of sex. Whereas two people who are in a married relationship, which is a sexual relationship, have made the right vows, they're in the right type of relationship, and therefore it's perfectly fine for two people to use artificial insemination to get pregnant. That in no way undermines God's purposes in sex. So there's a debate between the two denominations in their official teaching when it comes to artificial insemination. And in vitro fertilization, the mother's egg is fertilized by the father's sperm outside the womb. In vitro fertilization is sometimes referred to as making a test tube baby, which is a fairly crude way of describing a fairly sophisticated medical procedure, but it does help differentiate IVF from artificial insemination because IVF takes place outside the womb, if you like. That's a fairly easy way to remember it. Now, already you've lost the unitive aspect that Roman Catholic theology says is very important and is actually essential to following God's design. They say if you look at nature, sex was given so that a man and woman could become one body to create a new life, to create a new child. And that's lost in IVF and in artificial insemination. But there's a further problem. When the egg is fertilized, you have a new individual human life, a new individual human organism, which is growing and which is designed to grow and which wants to grow into a human being. And so it's on that drive to become a human baby and to grow and to develop as an organism. You have an individual human life. And because it's an individual human life, it's made in God's image. Well, okay, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that most eggs, when they are implanted into the uterus, most fertilized eggs, most individual human lives, most embryos don't make it. There's a lot of what they call wastage, which is a fairly cleaned up way of saying the woman loses the child. But it also means that a very expensive medical procedure has failed. So doctors try to implant more than one fertilized egg. They try to implant more than one embryo whenever they're performing IVF. Well, again, there's no huge problem there. But because it's so expensive, the way that, for example, in British medical practice that this quite often happens is that doctors will fertilize 8 eggs in the first round of IVF treatment, or the first time the woman goes in for IVF treatment, there'll be 8 eggs fertilized, so you'll have 8 embryos. Now, women obviously are not designed to carry 8 embryos to term. The human body is not designed for that. At most, you can implant 4 at a time. Well, again, where's the problem? Well, the problem is that if the first round is successful and the woman has a child, what do you do with the 4 frozen embryos which have been stored just in case you need to use them? You've got 4 human lives there, which according to Christian teaching are made in God's image. And if they were implanted into a womb, if they were put into their natural environment and given a chance to grow, they would grow into babies. I mean, they are individual humans designed to grow into human infants and then into human adults. They're made in God's image. What do you do with them? And a lot of scientists would say, well, what we'd like to do is experiment on them. At that stage, the child will be made of stem cells that can turn into any other type of cell, for example, and scientists would like to do lots of experiments on embryos for that reason, and a lot of scientists would like to experiment in embryos for a lot of other reasons. Now, again, at this stage, you're talking about human individual human beings, but there's no brain, there's no heart. As a matter of fact, whenever the spinal column begins to form, scientists and the law basically says no more experimentation at that point. But you're still using an individual human life as if it is a thing and not a person, as if it is an object and not something sacred. And so there is a problem with IVF in that it creates these extra human beings that are treated as objects that can be disposed of if they are of no use, or can be experimented on if scientists argue that they're going to waste. So A lot of evangelical Christians will say, well, IVF is okay for a married couple, but they cannot create spare embryos. Or if they create spare embryos, you have a duty to go through another round of IVF to give birth to that child. Other Christians will come back and say, well, listen, there is a large amount of wastage naturally when two people try to have a child. And therefore, perhaps we shouldn't be so concerned about this amount of embryo wastage. It's a difficult area, but you do need to know about it. And whenever you're talking about embryos, remember that again, in the Christian view, every individual human being is made in God's image. Some Christians would come back and have argued, well, because there is no nervous system, there couldn't be anything like a soul in that child, therefore it's not a full human being. That seems to be a stretch. It would still seem to be something that's made in God's image, whether or not a soul is present, if you wanted to go down that line. But the argument is there, you can mention it if you like. Another form of fertility treatment, although I think it's a large stretch to call this a treatment, there's nothing particularly medical about it, is surrogacy. And in surrogacy, a woman will effectively carry another woman's child. Now, there are two forms of surrogacy. In the old-fashioned form of surrogacy, the surrogate mother will be biologically related to the baby. So you can have a situation where a mother will say, well, listen, I will have a child and give it to you when it's born. The child might be conceived through artificial insemination, for example, but it's the surrogate mother's egg has been used, it's been fertilized, that becomes a child which is related to her, and then she agrees to give it over. Of course, with IVF now, a woman can offer to carry a child. For a woman, for example, who doesn't have a womb, she can offer to carry a child and to give that child over when it's born. And if you've used IVF, then that woman need not be genetically related to the child at all, because an egg can come from woman A and from her partner. Woman partner's sperm will be used, and fertilization will take place outside the womb using IVF, and then that can be implanted in woman B, who carries the child and then gives it to the original couple whenever the child has been born. There are concerns now, particularly from feminists, not just from Christians, over surrogacy. Obviously, this raises the issue of bringing a third person into the marriage or into the family. It's bringing a third parent in. But there's a further problem here in that women are quite often paid money for this service, and many feminists are worried that you're using a woman's body as if it's a machine for carrying a child. And there's been some pushback from feminists on the issue of surrogacy. Now, not many, it wouldn't be a majority position within feminism, but there are feminists who would argue that this goes against women's rights. And because if IVF is used, there's all sorts of treatments and different things that go on with in surrogacy, there can be risks that the surrogate mother carries. And quite often the argument would be is that women are not made aware of these risks, and they're certainly not made aware of the psychological trauma of having to give up a child which they have carried to another couple. So there has been a pushback here from feminists on the issue of surrogacy and just how ethical it is to use a woman's body for a financial transaction like this, for people to make money out of carrying a child. Some people would say that it should be allowed voluntarily, that somebody could volunteer to do this for a family member, for example. Again, Christians would have difficulty here because it is introducing another person into the married relationship. So many Christians would at least find it troubling. So it's worth noting here that we can have a situation where there are two mothers involved in a child's birth. We can actually have situations now where a woman's DNA can be put into another woman's egg, so you can have two biological mothers plus a third mother who's a surrogate mother plus a biological father plus another father who adopts the child. And in this case, and in this situation, Roman Catholics are going to come back in and say, do you see the chaos whenever you move away from sex? It just leads to the disaster. So their view is not necessarily as irrational or as harsh.